Welcome to the channel. In today's video, I've got a recently qualified solicitor on board, and she's going to be sharing great tips, lessons, and her own experience on how you can become a lawyer in the UK. This is the sequel to a video that I made previously a while ago explaining and narrating the process of how to become a lawyer. In this video, you're going to be hearing firsthand the experience of someone who recently got qualified as a solicitor within UK. If you'd like to know more, please keep watching. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so we have on board today a recently qualified solicitor, like I said. Her name is Hawau, and you've also sent in your lovely questions, which I have listed with me here, and we are going to be going through most of them, or some of them, as much as we can cover in the time that we have. So the first question that I have here is, can you share your background, introduce yourself, your background in terms of where you were previously qualified, and a little bit about how you got qualified previously before we jump into how you got qualified as a solicitor in UK.
Okay, that's fine. My name is Hawau. Previously, I was qualified as a lawyer in Nigeria. So I was called to the bar in 2019, and then I moved to the UK in 2020. I did a master's program, and like most people that have a very traditional way of thinking about law, um, one of the things I was thinking of was how to become a lawyer in the UK. Okay, so by the UK, by the way, I mean England and Wales. So I'm qualified as a solicitor of the Senior Court of England and Wales. It doesn't extend to Scotland or Northern Ireland. So I did some sort of research on both of them, but I think I was also guided from my experience in Nigeria that I did not really want to go to court. So the barrister route was kind of shut off for me on that path, and I was exploring more on the solicitor route. And around the time I came was when the SQE also sort of kicked off. So I learned about that path. So I had to do the SQE one, and also thought I had to do the SQE two. I'm sure there are questions about exemption later on where I'll speak about that. But I sort of went into the whole thing very blindly. So I just saw exams. You have to do exams. Just started the exams, and 2 years after, 1 year after, I became qualified.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. And I know you're still going to delve into the journey much later on, but thank you for bringing up, the difference between the solicitor and barrister. Someone had actually asked if you could work as a barrister and a solicitor. And I think in the previous video or the original video that led to more questions on this, I'd actually explained and distinguished that. And I'd also spoke briefly about some of the things you mentioned about the SQE process, introduction of that process. Thank you so much for bringing that up. The next question I have here is, in your own words, can you take us through the SQE1 and SQE2 process? Your own experience, how was it, doing that process? Because some people have also asked, if you could work. So I understand you were working at the time. So how was your own personal experience, just getting through the SQE1 and SQE2 process?
Um, f- by the time I started doing my SQE, I was already working in a not really a law firm. It was like an alternative legal services provider that time as well. So it was very difficult. It was a new experience for me. Yeah, I just went into it. Did the SQA one. So SQA one for people from common law jurisdiction, where I would assume most of the viewers here are from, is going to be around subjects that you're quite familiar with. So things like business law practice, property law practice, contract torts, um, wills and estate administration, or is it probate administration, then taxation. So those areas were sort of familiar. There was some things about administrative law, constitutional law, which would be a bit different. Obviously, from country to country, their constitutional law might be a bit different. And coming to a place like England and Wales as well, where you have to contend with an unwritten constitution, which is very different from if you are from Nigeria, because any Nigerian constitutional law class, I don't think you can escape a class without them screaming into your ears that the constitution is the ground norm, or whatever they call it. So that's a bit different because they have an unwritten constitution here, and the constitution is not supreme, the parliament is supreme. So that was a bit different from what I had learned from Nigeria. But apart from that, the principles of church are the same, the principles of contract are the same, the principles of um hierarchy of courts, which very much is from the common law jurisdiction, like the UK, like England, is the same. So that ground is a very similar ground. So it's a comfortable ground for you to go into um, and start studying. So it was quite easy for me to say, well, these are the things that I know already, and these are the things that I have to now pick out and say, well, I need to learn more about it. Like areas of taxation, for example. Taxation is quite difficult, but the good thing about the exam is that the standard of the exam is what a newly qualified solicitor should know. So it's not necessarily that you are going to be a tax expert. But I'll just say if you are studying for the exams, not that you shouldn't, but don't waste your time. Um, Many of the questions, my year and subsequent years after and before me, the examiners don't waste their time. There's so many juicy areas of law, um, and there's just a few number of questions that they're going to rather ask you those areas rather than asking you questions that test whether you're a tax expert or not. And then with the SQA one, I think we'll talk about um, exam providers
Yeah.
subsequently, but with the SQA one, I did use BABRI because it was new for me as well. So I just thought maybe I should pay the extra fees and use a training provider. So I use Barbary. And the good thing about Barbary is that they say it from day one that they're not training you for awards in this exam. They're just training you to pass, which is what I needed because I was too busy. And I just finished
Yeah.
multiple exams around that period as well. That was just after the time I had finished my master's program. So the priority then wasn't for me
To
to
get a perfect score.
no, it wasn't. It was just to pass, and that's that. They were doing the barest minimum to make you pass. They did not waste your time, even in terms of their material. It was very abridged, and everything you needed was in those materials. So that was very useful for me. And then jumping into SQE two, obviously I
Sorry,
had
before
passed
you go
SQE.
into SQE2, you mentioned the taxation. Just for clarity purposes, the tax part is part of business law within the SQE1, or is the
Yes, so
tax separate course?
tax is separate, but is still linked to the other subjects. So it covers areas like business law, as you rightly mentioned, but it also covers um, wills and probate administration too. So it covers those areas within the SQE one that tax issues can arise from.
Okay.
I'm sure they'll be aware that for exams, you have to learn the substantive areas of law, but you also have to learn the skill of answering exam questions as well. So with the way they draft the questions, sometimes it's not necessarily the incorrect answer. The incorrect answer might not be most very glaring. It might just be the most correct answer.
Okay.
So the other options might not necessarily be incorrect depending on the context, but there's obviously one that is most correct in that situation,
Okay.
which is a skill that you would get if you answer a lot of practice questions.
Okay. And at Babri, with the training provider, you got access to past questions and resources on answering
Yes.
questions you needed.
Yes, so not past questions because the SRA doesn't release past questions, but
Okay.
practice questions, and they also have practice questions on their website. That's the SRA website.
Okay.
But for Barbary, there was so many of them. So after each topic that they did, they had practice questions. Then after a group of topics too, they did practice questions, and then they did a lot of mock questions as well.
And the questions, and this is just off the top of my head, the questions that were on SRA website or with Babri, were they similar to what you encountered in the exam, or they were not really?
Well, if I'm being honest, the questions on the SRA website and Barbary made me feel like I was 80% prepared. But when I did the exam, I felt like perhaps what I had I was actually 40% prepared, if I'm being honest. The questions were a bit easier. um, which is quite shocking because most times people try to do practice questions to be a bit more
Harder.
difficult than what you
Yeah.
encounter, but they were too chill. And it was a good outlook to the exam. It was a bit more difficult than what I had anticipated. And it was that wasn't just my own feedback. There was a group I was on, and some of the people that used Barbary also said the question, so not the preparing, the training materials were up to the task of preparing for the exam, but the
Yeah.
questions that they put together as practice questions made it
Yeah.
seem easier than what we eventually got in the exam.
Yeah. So it was like Barbary and all those past questions were like beginner questions, and then you got to like an intermediate or advanced stage
Exactly.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. And just to put that out there, she actually, or our guest speaker actually passed the exam on the first sitting. So it
Oh
wasn't
yeah, I
like
did. Yeah, I did.
she had to retake it. So despite the
In
fact that
case
it
what
was
wasn't obvious, I don't think Favor would have invited me here if I didn't pass the exam.
so despite the fact that it was difficult, she still passed it on the first sitting. So that's like a form of encouragement that even though the questions you may encounter at the exam or might be different from the practice questions, it's still a possibility that you can pass it. So you were going on to the SQE too before I cut in.
Yes. And just to encourage people as well, the exam is for a span of 2 days. So even if the first one wasn't particularly good for you, just as normal exam thinking, don't let it affect the second day. You still have another paper to go into. And with the SQE one, it's a bit more advantageous than the SQE two because even if anything happens and you failed the FLK one. So when I was listing the subject, I listed the ones that were the functioning legal knowledge one and two. They separate it into days and into past levels as well. So they allow you to take the area that you receipt the area that you failed, and you don't have to receipt the other area. You also don't have to pay for the other area too. So just think of that even if the first day has gone really bad for you, you still have more papers to write and like just have that mindset of continuing your exam and still giving yourself the opportunity to pass, even if it's just the second one. It's better than failing both.
And was it in person or online? The
No, it
exam.
was in person.
So SQE two now.
Okay, so SQE2 was a bit of a different ball game for me because I had passed SQE1 and at this point I was already mentoring people to do the SQE1. So I feel like I got a bit confident. Not confident. I was confident is good. I'll say I got a bit cocky and then I was just like, "Oh, I don't need any training provider." At this point also, I was also in a job that I had to go to court for. So, and SQE2 is also more of practice. So, whereas SQE1 might test your knowledge of substantive law, SQE2 is more modeled after Nigerian law school for people that have gone to Nigerian law school. So, it's more procedural law practice. So, if you have some experience with that area of law, then it might not be necessarily difficult for you. I saw some free courses on from QLTS. That's another training provider. They had some free questions. So I saw that as well. And the good thing about SQE2 is that the SRA website is a bit more in depth with their questions. So they give you the scenario, they give you two different answers. So there's one answer which is the excellent answer, and then there's one answer which is still acceptable. So when you answer the questions, you can see where you are. If you are off tangent, you know that you're not ready for the exam on both of the answers. But if you're somewhere in between, or even on the excellent one, then you know that you kind of know how they want you to answer the questions. So going into the exam more for SQE2, it was a lot more difficult. So there's an oral assessment where you also have to talk in front of an examiner. And those areas would be on interview and attendance notes, slash legal analysis, and then advocacy. So for the interview, your examiner is going to act as um, also a client or maybe another solicitor from another organization, depending on what the question is about. And then for advocacy, your examiner is going to act as a judge, so a judge of whatever court, and you're going to appear before them. So obviously they're going to test how you address the court, how you handle legal issues, and also like certain areas surrounding your um, ability to present your issues as well. So it's a bit um, it covers a bit more wider range than what the SQE does, which just tests your understanding of the black letter law. And then it is also on a lot more days as well. So we started with the writing assessment, and then we had a long break, and then came, I think my break was like 4 days in between, and then I came back for the oral assessment. Um, yeah, so that was the SQE2. So
So the SQE2 in nutshell is more of theory and role play.
yes, yes, that's the way to put it. Yeah.
Okay. So, and I think this kind of summarizes the entire process. Okay. And just riding off of that, can you be selective with the dates of the exams? I know there's a registration window, but is it like all these, project management certification or other certification courses that once you register, you have to take the exam within 2 months, or the dates are fixed? You have to go in for the exams at selected dates according to the SRA.
So when you book, you have to book a date,
Okay.
but then you can always move the dates. Depending on when you move, there might be penalties that you have to pay. Within a period, they can give you all your money back. Within certain times, they might give you a percentage of your money back. But when it's too close to the exam, because obviously they've made commitments as well, um, they're not going to be able to refund your money.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. That really does make sense. And for some of the things that you mentioned, I'll try to link it in the description. So if anybody is interested in checking out the SRA website, BABRI, or some of the training resources, I'll try my best to link it in the description so you can check that out. So moving on speedily or swiftly to the next question. I think this question is riding off of the other questions. Is would you recommend using a training provider? And I like the fact that your experience kind of covers using a training provider and not using a training provider. So you're in the perfect, situation or position to address if you would recommend using a training provider for both the SQE1 and the second part.
Okay. Using a training provider, I think it depends a lot on the kind of learner you are and also the kind of experience that you have. Um, with the SQA one, now I'm obviously saying this in retrospect and also with the knowledge that I passed the exam, but I also may have been able to go ahead with the SQA one even better than the SQA two without a training provider, just because I did my undergraduate in law in Nigeria for 5 years, and 5 years is a long stretch of time to learn about contract and tort and all of that. So it was a repetition of a lot of things that I already knew. So there's so many people that have passed both exams, the SQ one especially, um, without a training provider at all. So like I said, depends on the kind of learner that you are. So if you need a bit more encouragement, if you need to also be a bit more streamlined about what you should be learning rather than just thinking, oh, do I need this? Do I need to go to also learn this? A training provider would be very useful for you. But if you are more comfortable, maybe you know someone who's done the exam before, or you've gone through the SRA website, which is very detailed about what exactly they want um, from anybody sitting the exams. If you see it and you're a bit more confident that I can I can do this on my own, then you do not necessarily need a training provider. If I'm being very fair with my judgment, I would say that if you are um sort of trying to weigh your options, like you want a training provider for one or not the other, perhaps the SQE, it might be wiser to get a training provider for the SQE too, just because it covers a more expansive area of law and there's so many things that you would miss. I remember going for my SQE2 exam, and some of the people that had used training providers, first, they had the opportunity of learning in clusters. So they knew themselves, they had practiced advocacy with themselves. The only person I practiced anything with was my mirror. There was there was no, but and if I had used a training provider, it was more likely that I probably would have been paired up. So some of the things that were new to me on the first day were things they were already used to. And with exams, sometimes you need that confidence to be able to go in and not be looking around like, am I writing the same exam with these people? Which was what I felt when I went for the SQE too. A lot also depends on your money. Some of these training providers, um, the cost of their training is more expensive than the exam itself. So it might be a thing to just weigh your options. If you think that you want a training provider, there's no point rushing into the exam and then failing and having to do it again. So if you think you want a training provider, then it might be worth saving up for it and doing it. But if you are like me, you've you're qualified as a lawyer in another jurisdiction, especially in Nigeria, where we have very similar um, areas of law, practice of law rather, and you've also been a student for a very long time, and you are conversant with the art of passing exams. And like me, also, you don't have that much money to spend, then you can actually do both exams without a training provider.
It will just take you doing the extra work that a training provider would have given you, and you would have to motivate yourself or find some other form of motivation.
Motivate yourself and also try to network as well. Many people reach out on LinkedIn to people who have done the exams before, because I was speaking about streamlining. Um, if you don't want to go through a training provider, that's something that someone who has done the exam previously would help with. And also make the SRA website your best friend. Training providers will break down what the SRA website says, but there's no extensive coverage of what the exam requires of you that you get anywhere else than the SRA website. They're the ones setting the exams, and they tell you everything that they want you to know.
Yeah. So I'm also going to link the SRA website in the description for those who may be interested. And I think overall, from another perspective, which I want you to speak on briefly, is on working. So bearing in mind that a lot of people would be working, whether they are working a full-time role or a part-time role, and also trying to sit or wanting to sit for the exam, would you recommend a training provider given your own experience of working at the same time as well?
Okay. With my experience, like I said, both I worked both times. So when I had a training provider, I worked. When I did not, I worked as well. But having a training provider in the first time probably helped me in this area to also know how much I needed to study. So the target for BABRI was 20 hours a week. If you were working full time, and they structured their training in within those 20 hours in a week, which was very helpful for me as well when I was self-studying. So just knowing that my limits, the least studying I should do in a week would be 20 hours. And if you break down that in a matter of days, that's very easy. So even if you are just able to get 2 hours in every day, weekday when you have to go to work, and then get more hours in during the weekends, you'll still be able to meet your target or higher. So towards the time of the exam, I had to take an entire week off work. So having that whole week to myself as well helped with the studying. So just planning your time, and even if it's just 30 minutes, like not thinking that I have to do 6 hours or I have to do 8 hours before I'm studying, even if it's just 30 minutes that you can get in a day if you are working full time. It's stressful to work full time and have to study as well. So just be kind to yourself and know that you're not a machine, but don't close down your book because you are looking for a longer period of time or stretch of time to study. Anything that you can do, even if it's just one page, it's better than nothing.
Yeah, so I like that. So just take it in bits and pieces. You don't necessarily have to have that long stretch. That's a very valid point. The next question is almost similar, and I think you really dealt on it, and is on if you can pass the exam without using a training provider. And I think so we don't flog the us multiple times. You've
Yeah,
already
just simple. Yes, you can.
yes, you can, as you if you're willing to do the work. So
Yeah.
what you're missing out with the training provider, you would have to put in that work. The next question here says, is it possible to get full exemption as a Nigerian lawyer? I also want you to speak of generally as a lawyer from common law jurisdiction. So I don't think someone from civil law jurisdiction will be trying to get an exemption, but then as a lawyer from the common law jurisdiction, is it possible to get an exemption?
So you might get an exemption for the functioning legal knowledge one or functioning legal knowledge two, but more specifically for qualified lawyers from common law jurisdictions. So there's an SQE2 exemption finder on the SRA website where you can just look for your country. So if your country is not on that list, first, you know that you cannot get an um, SQE2 exemption at all. But then if your country is on the list, so I'll do with Nigeria because that's where I was qualified. Um, so with Nigeria, if you are a barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Nigeria, you can apply for SQE2 exemption. For the SQE2 exemption, what it says you need is to provide a certificate evidencing your professional qualification from the Supreme Court of Nigeria. So the English they're just saying here is your call to bar certificate and your qualifying certificate. Then a reference showing that you have at least 12 months legal work experience post qualification as a Nigerian barrister and solicitor, and then proof of your referee's professional qualification. So you could use a certificate of good standing from the Supreme Court or their admission certificate. And if you can provide this, then you would qualify. And the rationale behind this is obviously because the SQE2 is testing your ability to practice as a solicitor. If you have already practiced in another jurisdiction, then it makes sense that you can apply to be exempt from showing them that you have the capacity to practice. So
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And just on that point as well, I wanted to ask if that qualification document that I said for 12 months experience, do you know if you can get that from a law firm? Maybe if you had worked previously and you just get your law firm to send that in, would that also count?
yeah, that's where they expect you to get it. So it's work experience. So the law firm where you have worked, someone who's standing as a referee for you. My case was a bit different because I left Nigeria almost immediately after qualifying as a lawyer in Nigeria. So I didn't really have that work experience. I didn't even want to explore that area at all. That's why it was just easier for me to do the SQE2. But if you have worked, there's no point doing the exam because it's even the more difficult exam. So there's really no point putting yourself through telling them that you have the skills to practice as a lawyer.
Okay. I think definitely going to include the link in the description again. But then there's also something I wanted to mention. I know that some of the people that I have spoken to about getting exemption usually say they get letter from the NBA as well. And the NBA is the Nigerian Bar Association if you're from Nigeria. So if that's your your jurisdiction, so that's something
Yeah,
you might also want to explore as well. It's better to go through the hassle and the rigors of getting the exemption than
yeah,
going through the rigors of the exam again.
yeah, definitely.
We're almost done. The next question says, what are your top 3 tips to pass the exam? SQE 1 and 2. You might want to do 3 tips per exam or just 3 tips in general.
The first tip from me would be to simplify the process as much as possible for yourself. It's a difficult exam, but it's also a very simple exam. And the more difficult you think it is, the more likely it's going to look very difficult for you. So I remember doing the exam and going to the exam halls and just hearing things that people were saying rather, that really had nothing to do with the exam, but because they knew that they were doing an exam that would make them qualify as solicitors in England and Wales, somehow in people's heads, you want to make it seem very difficult, but to be honest, it's not. So just know that you can pass it and be chill and write the exam. The second thing I'll say is that there's no shortcut to studying. Even though I've said simplify the process, I don't mean you should sleep and not study. I mean, like, you still have to study, but study in a way that you don't think you are going to do the most difficult exam in your life. But you still have to study. You still have to make sure that you are not abandoning your studying and leaving it for a longer period of time. The more conversant you are with the concepts, with the principles, and also with the past questions, um, the easier it will be to answer the questions in the exam. And then with the third thing I'll say is also with past questions. Don't waste your time just studying, so especially for the SQE one. Just because I think I've mentioned previously that a chunk of what is also tested is your capacity to answer questions. So just do as many past questions as you can. Look at the sneaky areas where they try to throw people off. If you've done law school in Nigeria with the MCQ as well, you would know some questions where um, they try to throw you off if you don't read the question properly. With SQE one as well, they try to waste your time. So they can. I remember we had scenarios that were like 2 pages long for a multiple choice question, and then you just go to the question part and it's one line, but you've spent so much time reading 2 pages and you are timed for the exam. When your time is up, you can't continue answering questions. You have to leave. So what I learned to do the second day was to read the questions first, because reading the questions first will put your mind in the space of knowing what you're looking for when you now read the longer scenario that they've presented you with. So just knowing how to answer questions, and you would know better how to answer questions the more past questions that you expose yourself to. And well, I've said 3 tips, but obviously we're Nigerians. I don't think there's any tips without saying prayer because you do need to also um pray and just believe in yourself as well and know that you can definitely pass the exam.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Those are really helpful tips. And I like the fact that you said, go straight to the question. That I think that's something that will really help people. And that question here says, how would you rate your experience, the SQE 1 and 2, which was harder? But I think you've answered that already, that the second one
Second was
was,
definitely harder.
was definitely harder. So, but you passed both on both exams on the first sitting. So even, I think maybe your hard experience is not the normal regular hard experience for people. If you keep passing it, just
Yeah,
even though it was harder.
the second one just threw me off a bit because I was more prepared for the first one. Things are always more difficult if you're not prepared for them, no matter how simple they are. So I was more prepared for the first one. The second one also had to do with more direct human interaction. So with the first one, where it was just you and your paper, with the second one, there was a lot that was being tested. So when you had to do interview, it was very difficult putting yourself in the mindset that I have to think of this person as an interviewee, um, but I also have to think of this person as an examiner, because
Yeah.
in the end, they are judging everything that you say, and they are the ones that are going to score you. So that was a bit of a more stressful situation to be in, and that's why the practice is very important. Even if you don't eventually use a training provider, if you just have um, someone that you can practice the questions with, let them ask you questions. It would help you be a bit less anxious about facing the exam.
Thank you very much. And I think the final question here says, how much is the exam? So how much costs with a training provider and without?
The SQA one currently it's £1,798, and they've done it as 899 for the FLK one and 899 for the FLK two. So anyone who has to receipt the FLK one, for example, will just have to pay the 899. But if you're doing the exam for the first time, that's the um total fee. Rules are a bit different if you just have to do one exam where you can just pay for that one. And then the SQE2 is a bit more expensive. It's 2,766. There's no differentiation in this one. So anyone who unfortunately doesn't pass the SQE2, you can't say, well, I just did not pass these subjects and that's the only one I want to do. They don't give you that opportunity. You have to do the entire exam, which is why if there's an opportunity for you to get an exemption, get the exemption. Um, so those are the costs. Both of them is taken to almost to over £4,000 if my math is correct. Um, with the training providers, um, there's so many training providers, but from what I have seen, their fees range from just over £1,000 to over £3,000 for each exam. The SQE2, they charge higher for the SQE2, but most of the training providers charge more than the cost of the exam is. That's a trend that I've noticed. So it's a very expensive exam. It's definitely an exam that you want to pass because after spending all of this
You
money,
know, you cannot feel.
the,
I
the
agree.
the disappointment is just going to be multi-layered because you think of the disappointment of failing an exam, everybody is going to be disappointed, but you also think about the disappointment of
Of
the
the
amount of
money.
money that you have spent and that you may potentially have to spend if you decide to go ahead with it. So
Yeah.
it's quite an expensive one.
Yeah. I think this are just about all the questions we have. Thank you very, very much for answering, taking out time to answer all of these questions. I believe they've been really, really helpful. If you still have any questions, please leave them in the comment section. We'll also try to put all the links to as many resources and the SRA website in particular in the description. So you might want to check that out. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel and do well to thank our special guests for coming on today. And yes, until next time, we'll see you in the next video. And if you have any questions, once again, please leave them in the comment section and we'll catch up in the next time. Bye.